and exposure. Now, ISO is, let me just get that right slide going. Here we go. There we are. ISO. It's not ISO. It's not an acronym. It's just ISO, and you'll write it ISO 3200 or something like that for 3200. So that's the way it's pronounced. But what does it really mean? And this messes with people's heads to a certain extent. Think of it like this. If you were playing a record, as in vinyl, for those of you who remember such things, the little signal from the stylus was very, very small voltages, tiny little magnets moving. You need to amplify that voltage. That's what the ISO does in a camera. It amplifies the voltages that are created when light hits the sensor. So each of the little photo sites on your sensor is a photovoltaic cell, essentially, and when light hits it, it generates a voltage. And it's very complicated how it works. I honestly don't understand deeply how that side of things works. All I know is it produces a very small voltage, and that is amplified by the circuitry in that sensor, and there's some secret sauce going on there that each of the different sensor manufacturers does. But fundamentally, if you want to increase the sensitivity of the sensor, you can't. The sensor has a fixed sensitivity to light, but what you can do is amplify the signal that you do get, and that's what ISO is. Now, back in film days, it used to be the speed rating of the film, or ASA, and it used to be to do with the size of the grains of photosensitive chemical in the film itself. The bigger the grain, the more light sensitive it was. It's not as simple as that now. What we've got is an analogy of that to give you a subjectively similar result, whereas you double the ISO, you double the exposure. Now, also what's going on in the camera are some adjustments to the file itself, to the actual data, like a gamma curve can be added or some processing can be done, which we are not aware of. So it's not an exact science from our perspective on the outside looking in. The idea is that if you increase the ISO by one step, which is a doubling, like apertures were and shutter speeds, say from 100 to 200 to 400, that will change the lightness of the image by the same amount as changing the shutter speed or the aperture, or a combination of the two. That's really what you need to know. The amplification of the signal is done in the same size steps as apertures and shutter speeds. So bear that in mind, okay? This is the price that we pay for amplification. And think of it in terms of hiss from your stereo system. The more you turn up the volume, the more hiss you get, the more crackles and pops you get from that vinyl record. Or even with a DVD these days, if you turn the volume right up to 11, you're going to hear some noise. And what that is random electrons bouncing around in the wires, to put it crudely. So it's every single electronic system that exists has a base level of noise in it. The higher the quality of the system, the less that noise is. And when you crank that amplification up, and in this case to 12,500 as an example, what you're seeing is that randomized underlying levels of noise, which you can't do anything about. Better cameras have lower results, like the new SL2S, which I actually have out of camera here, it's filming this, has astonishingly low noise at high ISO, but this is what it looks like. And on the left, you'll see, this is at 1600 ISO, or ISO 1600, you'll see that there is a faint granularity. It's not bad. The 12,500, you might be forgiven for thinking that looks pretty awful. Now, this is actually a section of a photograph with dark clouds in it, and those dark midtones tend to show sort of mid to dark tones, not blacks but not midtones or lights. Those middle darks tend to show up noise the worst. When it's black, obviously it's just solid black, but in those darker tones you'll see the noise the worst. The point I would like to make this evening, and if you remember nothing else from this, is don't be afraid of noise like this. Because what you're looking at on the screen now, and I'm hoping it's coming through on the video feed okay, is that image viewed at 100% on the screen. So it's hugely magnified. When you export images and view them on other devices, that original file size is almost always reduced. Like if you look at a picture on an iPad, or you look at it on a phone, or you look at it on the internet, you put a picture on Facebook or something, that's been sampled down and the noise tends to disappear. So noise is something that you really shouldn't be afraid of, and it's all about getting a sharp photograph. I don't care if a picture is noisy, as long as it's sharp. And that requires a decent shutter speed to freeze either subject movement or camera movement. And if we think back to what I was talking about last month about shutter speeds, remember how I was saying there's like a minimum threshold shutter speed you should be using when you're hand holding? Or if you want to freeze subject movement, you need to be thinking in terms of what shutter speed will freeze that subject. Now, when you are thinking like that, that has to be your priority, getting a sharp image. And if the image is noisy, it doesn't matter. So here's something. You need to use whatever ISO is necessary to get a shutter speed which gives you a sharp picture. So you don't use ISO for its own sake. If you want a picture that is actually grainy for some artistic reason, you can always add that later. You wouldn't be using high ISO to get that effect necessarily. Maybe you want to, I don't know. But the sharpness of the image is something that you should be pushing for, because a unsharp image due to subject movement, blur, or worse, camera shake is not possible to use. You cannot recover. That's not entirely true. You can recover it a tiny, tiny bit. There's a particular filter in Photoshop that allows you to just remove a little bit of camera shake, but it's minimal. But fundamentally, you need to be getting a sharp picture, which means using whatever ISO is necessary so that the shutter speed and aperture that you want to use and you need to use are sufficient to get that sharp image. Okay, and I'm going to say this more than once, but it's absolutely critical. So remember, the noise is never as bad in the final result as it looks on screen. What you're looking at on screen is appallingly unforgiving. And even if it is noisy, as long as it's sharp, you can do something with that picture. All right. This is Russell Shakespeare, one of my good friends up here, and I was doing some photographs of him photographing somebody else, Michael Zavros, an artist. I was actually filming him and doing some stills. And the reason I put this picture in is it's a good example of how an image can look at high ISO. I'm going to ask you to have a wild guess at what the ISO was of this shot, and it was taken on the Leica SL2, which is this camera. And I'm going to have to wait 30 seconds for the delay in the feed to pick up, so I'll just keep talking. But at some point, just type in what you reckon, because I think this image looks really, really clean on the screen, certainly in front of me now. And bear in mind that the SL2 has an original image capture of 8,000 pixels, give or take, across. And what you're looking at on the screen is 1,920, so it's 1/4 of its original size. So let's just see what people come up with, and then I will move on and show you the differences between original noisy pictures and color corrected ones, and also noise reduced pictures as well. Catherine Wilson reckons 1,200. I'm going to say nope. We can go up a little bit one. Gary Gort, no, 3,200, 800. 1,600, 1,600, nope. Here we go. All right, so Anthony Chamberlain says 6,400, and he is on the money. This image was taken at 6,400 ISO on the SL2, which is a very high resolution sensor, and high resolution sensors are not known for their ability at high ISO. You'll often find the really, really best cameras at high ISO have slightly lower resolution. The SL2S is a 24 megapixel camera, and that has even better ISO, but it's still good. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. And this is what it is magnified about another 100%. And this is straight out of camera with no adjustments. That's important. Now, I'm hoping you can see, and it may be difficult in this video feed, but if you look in the glasses, not Russell's glasses, but these glasses painted here, there's this dark, sort of mid to dark tone here. I'm hoping you can see a very subtle blotchy green purple effect. That is chroma noise, and if we go back to the couple of shots before that to there, on that right hand side you'll see what I mean. That's called chroma noise, and it's color noise, and it's astonishingly easy to remove in post. If you just turn up the color noise reduction slider in Lightroom, it just disappears. It's absolutely effortless. So let me just come back to that one of Russell. So that's straight out of camera. We add the color noise reduction, and I'm hoping you'll see this, but if you watch his lips, you'll see a slight reduction in pink. That's on, and I'm going to go step back a little bit and turn it off and on and off and on. And if you look in, this is off and on. And if you look in the glasses on the left there, you should see that chroma noise go. That's pretty good. Now, if you go too far, and I would argue now that there's very little more that needs to be done with this picture, that the luminance noise, which is variations in brightness, not in color, that's a lot harder to remove in post, because if you think about it, what else is the variation between pixel values? Well, that's detail, isn't it? Like an edge will have a step in brightness from darker to lighter, say, or whatever. That's what detail is. So when you're reducing noise, you have to be very, very careful that the noise is not mistaken for detail, and you end up with something more like this. Now, this isn't bad, but I'm hoping you can see in this feed that his hair has gone a little smudgy, a little bit flat looking. It's lost that texture. And I'll go back one. That's without, and that's with. Now, this is not extreme, but I'm hoping you can see the difference. And I would suggest that you actually find some images you've shot with high ISO, a high ISO setting, and use the noise reduction in Lightroom or something similar, and just see how it feels. Because I've seen images that are so heavily noise reduced that they just look like they're shrink wrapped in plastic. They look all smudgy. This has been done by people who simply don't understand that noise is nowhere near as bad in the final result as it looks at first on your screen. So just take that on board. If it looks bad on the screen, it'll look fine. If it looks absolutely dreadful on the screen, maybe you'll have to do some work with it, but it's astonishing what you can get away with. I'll just tell you a little story about how I actually discovered this. One of my colleagues was working with me on one of the cruise ships I used to work for. Right now, not so much, but back then. And we were shooting some images in the rainforest in Papua New Guinea. And I've got one of the pictures coming up in a little while, which I'll refer back to. And he was using a phase 1 high resolution, the highest resolution camera on the market at the time. This is going back 6-7 years. And when I saw the results in the low light in the rainforest, and he was shooting at high ISO for that camera, which was only 400, they were horrible on the screen. And I remember being quite surprised, because I was shooting with the Leica S system, which was pretty good at 640 ISO or 1250. Much, much better on the screen than my colleague was getting with his camera. And I commented on this when I was looking at his laptop, and he said, haha, you wait till we make a print. And so when he made a print, which was an A2 print, about so big, the result was superb. And I remember that being a little teachable moment for me, because I kind of knew it to some degree, but to have it so clearly demonstrated was quite astonishing. So now I simply don't worry about noise. What I do is I worry about sharpness and getting the image sharp and crisp and well exposed. And if it's noisy, so be it. I am not afraid of ISO. So ISO increases the lightness of the image broadly, which allows you to use a higher shutter speed under the same lighting conditions. And you should use whatever shutter speed you need to use to get the movement cancelled out and a sharp image. This is Yothu Yindi, the band, playing up in Cairns a couple of years ago. And you needed to get a sharp image because he was moving around really strongly. Now, I only needed to use 1600 here. And my shutter speed, I forget what it was, but it was probably a 250th or 500th, really, freezing that movement. And you probably can't see on the screen that well, but his eye is absolutely razor sharp. But ISO does increase noise levels, and there is a limit, of course, about where the acceptable sort of limits of that lie, and that will be up to you. I would suggest that if you're only using your images for social media or iPad viewing, you could shoot at pretty much any ISO and nobody would ever notice. It only really comes into effect when you're making prints that are at the limit of the camera's resolution. So in the case of the SL2, somewhere around A0 or A1, or in the SL2S, maybe about A2 0.2, something like that. Then it starts to reveal any granularity. But what are inkjet prints made of? They're made of dots, and noise is dots. And when the noise is converted into dots of ink, it tends to kind of randomize out. So again, there's another part of the process that tends to remove the noise just because of the nature of the process itself. So it's quite astonishing how that noise tends to disappear. So don't be afraid of it. There is one other thing which I should mention, is that you use the ISO to get a sharp image. We mentioned that blurred images are impossible to fix and noisy images can be mostly fixed, but there is one other cost that you do pay, which might be significant. You do lose dynamic range. Now, it depends on the brand of camera, and some cameras are better than others, but for each step up from the base ISO, now the camera has a base ISO, and in the Leicas it's 100. You'd have to look at the manual and see what it was, but it'll be 100 or 200, something like that. Let's assume it's 100. When you go to 200, your dynamic range drops by 1 stop. Go to 400, another stop. So when you go right up the scale, you may find that your dynamic range has dropped off dramatically. It's not quite as simple as that, but you will see that your shadows are lacking in detail. And because shadows tend to be where the noise is mostly seen, you have to be fairly careful with your printing and your post-processing later on. So it does tend to compress that dynamic range. But again, if you get the shot, doesn't really matter, does it? I mean, this is shot at 6,400. This is Baker Boy, one of the bands that was playing with Yothu Yindi on stage up near Cairns. And it was all about the atmosphere and the movement and the energy. It wasn't about the technical perfection of the shot. That was just irrelevant. It was about getting that energy there. So I shot at whatever ISO I needed to get this particular picture. I see a comment from Chris Osborne. So there is an argument to set automatic ISO. Absolutely, and we're going to talk about that in a sec. In fact, it's my very next slide. So I want to just talk a little bit about auto ISO. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to myself for a moment. Hello, back again. And I'm going to refer you to this camera here. So let me just swap to my overhead view. So this is my SL2S up here, just out of frame, just there. And I'm looking down at the back of the camera. This is an SL2. Right now, you're looking at my old Leica 3G over here. I want to show you how auto ISO works because it's very, very important. So if you go into the menu of your camera, and all cameras have something similar to this, and I'm just going to go to page 2, I think it is. Should be there. That's page 1, bottom of page 1. There it is, auto ISO settings here. Now, this is very important. What you can set here is a maximum ISO that your camera is capable of using, or that you're comfortable using. And I would suggest you set it to the limit. Don't set it to anything low, and I'll hopefully explain why in a sec. The second setting, right now that's on 50,000. I'm hoping you can read this on the screen. The second one is the shutter speed limit. And what this means is when you're shooting in aperture priority, it works in other modes too, but let's just talk about aperture priority. You're setting the aperture and the camera is setting the shutter speed for you. That's the whole point of aperture priority. If the ISO was fixed, that shutter speed could be anything, whatever it needs to be to get a correct exposure. But if you have auto ISO set, that means that this 250th will be the lowest the shutter speed will ever get. And if you're transitioning from a bright to a dark area, let's say your shutter speed is 1,000th and your aperture is whatever it needs to be, f4 say. Then you go indoors and your shutter speed will drop as the light levels drop. But when it hits 250th, instead of going down, down and down and down, the ISO will go up instead. So the shutter speed drops to that threshold and then stops dropping. And as the light levels drop, the ISO then picks up the slack and starts going up. So what it means is you're never going to get a shutter speed less than 250th, which is absolutely brilliant. So by choosing that 250th there, you're guaranteed of using a 250th. Now that may not be sufficient. I know a couple of street photographers prefer to use a 500th of a second. I know Alan Schaller does that in London, and I think Jesse Marlowe has a lot to say about auto ISO as well, and I've heard it from other people. But there's a very strong argument for going for sharp above everything. Now, I'm not so sure that I would go with a 500th myself, but I don't shoot a lot of street. You need to set that lower shutter speed for whatever you think is appropriate for whatever you're doing. But it is a really, really effective way of working. If you're doing sport, wildlife, anything where the light's changing dramatically, then I would suggest that you consider using auto ISO. The reason I suggested that you don't set the upper limit to your auto ISO to something like 6,400 or whatever is because different cameras deal with the situation when the light levels drop so far that it needs to go higher. It butts up against that upper limit. And two things can happen. One, the picture gets more and more underexposed. Or two, the camera overrides the shutter speed limit and it drops even though you're not expecting it. And the SL2 and the SL2S work differently. On the SL2, don't ask me why, and I have actually had some communications with the development people at head office about this because I'm not quite sure why they work differently. There's pros and cons of both approaches, but if on the SL2 you set too low a limit, you'll find that the shutter speed does end up dropping when the light levels get really low, and then you risk too low a shutter speed, but you'll get a good exposure. Now, I think you've picked up so far that a good exposure is probably less important than a sharp image. So I don't care if the exposure is correct if I'm suddenly shooting at a quarter of a second and I've got a blurry picture. With the SL2S, what happens is the shutter speed stays at the threshold you've set and the picture becomes underexposed. And you might think, well, that's no good. I've now got a really underexposed picture. But here's something that you may not know, and it has interesting ramifications. Once you get up to ISO, depends on the camera, but I'm pretty sure it's around 3200. It could be 1600. It's not that high. Once you get past that point, it doesn't actually amplify the signal genuinely in the camera. It simply tags it in the metadata, and when you open in the raw converter, it compensates for it. Now that's a little bit counterintuitive. What it means is if you've got an image which was 3 stops underexposed at 3200 ISO, and then in Lightroom you correct that, you'll get almost an identical result to having set the ISO to 3 stops higher in the first place. It's really hard to pick them apart. And that's just the nature of how this stuff all works. It's really subtle. So that's why I would rather see my auto ISO shutter speed threshold honored and end up with a dark picture that I can correct later than have the camera try and give me or prioritize a correct exposure at the expense of my shutter speed. Now, that's quite difficult to explain. Hopefully I've got through to you with that one. And that aspect does vary from one camera to another. You'd have to actually test it and see, and just see how that all works. All right, so a couple of questions cropped up here, or just one. Vincent Ip, is it because the SL2S is more of a sport version of the SL2 and the SL2 is more of a studio camera? I suggest that you could be right there, Vincent. Having thought about it further, though, and I discussed this with my colleague in Rome, Maurizio Bellucci, who is my equivalent in Leica Academy, and we had an exchange of emails about this, and we came to the conclusion that there are no circumstances that we would prefer that shutter speed threshold not to be honoured. Okay, we don't want to have any surprises, because if you're in the studio, you're in controlled lighting conditions. The only time that you're going to be caught out by that shutter speed dropping is when you're in difficult lighting conditions, really dark lighting conditions. So we decided that we would rather have the shutter speed lower limit honoured and get a darker picture, which we can correct. So, but again, your mileage may vary, as they say. Okay, that's pretty much all I want to say about ISO. Don't be scared of it, and use it at whatever level you need to use it to make sure that your shutter speed is suitable for the subject that you're shooting. Now, if your subject is not moving and your camera's on a tripod, then there's absolutely no reason to use ISO for anything. Just set it on base and you might end up with a very long exposure. But if nothing is moving, that's just not important. It makes no difference to the picture if nothing is moving. It's only when things are moving that you have to worry about your shutter speed, for those of you who were listening last month. All right, let's get back to the second part of this, which is basically talking about exposure. Now, exposure is a little bit of a slippery concept, because what even is a correct exposure? There's two answers to this. These are the two answers. From the camera's point of view, and from a technical point of view, what you want is the highest possible data quality. And when you're making a print or you're displaying the image, you want it to look aesthetically pleasing, and they're not the same thing at all. It's entirely possible to have a picture which is too light subjectively, but is actually technically correct. But then when you've got back to the studio, or you're making a print, or you're preparing the image for display, you may darken that picture to taste. But the first exposure was actually technically correct. And let me explain what I mean by that. I'm hoping that you understand what histograms are telling you, either in the post-production software like Lightroom or actually on the back of the camera. And I'll come back to that in a sec. But here's just a little bit of a reminder. This is a histogram from Lightroom. It's very hard to take screenshots off the back of a camera. Oh, hang on, I haven't got my... There we go, sorry. I wasn't playing my slides. I'll just go back. Those are the two slides that I was showing before. There. Highest data quality capture and pleasing tonal distribution. Then I was going to show you this one. My bad. This is the histogram of this image in Lightroom. And on the back of the camera, it would look very similar. The difference being that on the back of the camera, particularly these cameras, you only get a luminance histogram, which is just the brightness. It's like an average of the three colors. In Lightroom, you see a color histogram, and some cameras do allow you to split your histogram into three parts, red, blue, and green, which is not that useful. So that's what we're looking at here. But just consider the overall shape. The actual color spikes are not important at this point. What you're looking at here is an image which is predominantly light. And what I'm looking at is this is the highlights, this is the shadows, and this is the midtone. So the data, and that's what this graph shows me, the bulk of the data is in the highlights. And you can see from the picture, there are no shadows. It's a bright sunny day. There's a lot of light bouncing off the beach. She's a very pale skinned child, and there just simply aren't any dark bits. And you can see there's no data down on the bottom here at all. There's midtones, which would be the pinks. In fact, there's the pinks there, the reds. That'll be those highlights there. And there's some skin tones in the middle. There's the, I'm not sure where the blue is, probably the shadow under here. But the bulk of it is this highlight. So this is what's called a high key image. That's not overexposed. It's just light. So light does not mean it's overexposed. This is the picture I was talking about from the rainforest in New Guinea, where my colleague had a really noisy image and mine looked really not noisy at all, but his print looked great. Anyway, this is the opposite of what we talked about before. This is a low-key image. This is not underexposed. This is just dark because the subject is dark. You don't want to average out all of the tones. If you photograph a black cat sitting on a pile of coal, it should be black. The coal should be black, the cat should be black, not grey. And if you photographed a white cat on a white blanket, you'd want a white cat on a white blanket, not a grey cat on a grey blanket. And this is where camera meters tend to get confused. You cannot fool a histogram. And I'm going to suggest to you in a sec that you use your histogram and something called highlight exposure warning in preference to any metering system. So I'll come back to that point in a sec. So that's a low-key image. And this is an average image. There's as much highlight, midtone, and shadow in this image as anything else. They're all evenly spread. And you can see the highlights have got a very distinct color tinge to them, and the shadows have got a blue tinge to them. But that's not important. What's important is that this occupies the entire range from left to right. That is a technical correct exposure. And in fact, going back, so is that. That occupies from shadow to highlight and this one. Whoops. And this one. Not quite from the shadows, because they are far less important than the highlights. This is the important bit. And in fact, if I was to point to the one most crucial part of this whole thought process, it's right where I'm pointing there. Where do the highlights sit against the right-hand side of the histogram? And they should be as far to the right as possible, and we'll explain more about that in a sec, why that's the case. And if you look at each of these images, there's the highlights, because that highlight in his eye, these highlights on his face here and here, they are really important, and they sit round about there. Same with this one. That exposure has been set so that my image data sits neatly between the darkest and the lightest that the sensor is capable of recording. The height of your histogram from there to there means precisely nothing. It simply scales the data to fit the histogram. That's why they get skinny or fat. If I go back one, you'll see that this one is quite tall here, but very skinny here. This one is tall here, and so on. So the height is actually not telling you anything at all. It's just scaled. Just remember, shadows, midtones, highlights, and your image data should fit neatly between the two. Doesn't mean that it's as light or as dark as you want the image to end up. It just means that you've maximized the quality of your data capture, which is what an exposure actually is. That you let the light in onto the sensor for a specific amount of time, at a specific aperture, and at a specific amplification factor, the ISO. The idea is that those three settings should allow each of those little photo sites to never be overexposed to the point where they just go white. That's your upper limit, because beyond that point, and if you look at this image, you'll see what I'm talking about. Middle picture, correct, you see? Exposure all the way from the left to the right. The image on the left is very underexposed, and there's a huge gap here with no data. You do not want that, because you are wasting quality. And this one, which I'm slightly blocking, I'm afraid, but these spikes on the side here are actually pushed up so far against the right-hand end of the histogram that you're getting this white clipping. And these details here, well, there are no details here. This skin tone, this is a white highlight that's what's called clipped. It's blown out to white, and it cannot be recovered. You can recover highlights a little bit in post, but if it's white, 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 as in each of the three channels is maxed out to 255, you got nothing. So you never want to do that. And that's the only hard limit. Once you've gone past that point, you're doomed. So I'm always thinking about where that limit is. Now, if you correct an image which is very underexposed, you can do it to a great extent. However, there is a price that you pay. Now, I have, hand on my heart, I have exaggerated this a bit. I was going to say this is a completely real example, but because the Leica files are so good in the shadows and because they're so clean, it is actually amazing how much you can recover an image when you have underexposed it too much. This one on the left was underexposed by about 3 whole stops, and I can simply crank up the exposure in Lightroom and you can't really pick them apart. What I've done is I've taken a JPEG of the same image and increased that one, just to give you an idea that in principle, correcting an underexposed image is not a good idea. It's far, far better to have a picture which is too light but not clipped and reduce the exposure later for aesthetic reasons than it is to have a picture which is too dark and increase its lightness for aesthetic reasons later, because what will happen is the shadow information in the very, very dark image will be compromised, and you'll start to see things like this. You can see how the hair has got detail in here, but it's got nothing in it here. Now, again, I have exaggerated this just to make the point, but making a picture lighter than you might want, but not clipped, and then darkening it is a much, much better idea than shooting conservatively and giving yourself some highlight headroom and then increasing the exposure later. Now, what we're talking about here is we are splitting hairs to a certain degree, but what I want you to take away from this is the best way to do something. It may not be the most practical way to do something, because you can get away with a lot of stuff with good quality digital cameras. But rather than rely on getting away with it, I'd rather you know how to get it exactly the best that's possible. And these things do have effects down the track. If you want to do a lot of post-production on an image and you want to make a really big print, you really, really need the best possible quality capture in the first place. Now, I've got a slightly geeky image to show you here, or graph. So I try to avoid these sorts of graphs, but this is why you need to expose to the right hand end of the histogram. The reason is that the quality of the data that you capture is simply not as good in the shadows as it is in the highlights. In fact, if you interpret this graph, you'll see that that brightest one stop of data, which is like white clouds and the detail in white clouds, actually uses up half of the entire bit depth of your image. Half of it, not just some, but half. And then each of those steps is halving. So by the time you're down into skin tones, can you see how much data is being ignored as you go down? And then your shadows, -8, -7, -6 from the top, you're down to quite only a very few steps. So once you start lightening image, which is too dark, you're trying to stretch these bars up to this. Whereas if you darken a picture, you're reducing these bars down to here. You're squashing rather than stretching. And when you stretch anything in digital terms, you start to see the steps between them. Because this is a digital file and you have a 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, not 1.5, 2.5, anything like that. They're digital, they're discrete steps. And if I try to stretch 128 tones into 16,384, I'm going to be able to see the steps. And that's what I mean by loss of shadow detail in that previous picture, because there isn't a great deal. And this is for high-end RAW files. JPEGs, it's even worse. You've only got 256 steps in total, which is here. But that's up here. So you've got 128, 64, 32, and so on. So that's why JPEGs have such minimal amount of detail in the shadows. So I don't want to go on too much about that one because it is definitely geeky, but that's why we expose to the right. When you've got a picture like this, and this is something that I want to you to really look at. What are we seeing here? Look at that histogram. Now, if you've ever done landscape photographs, I'm sure most of you will have done, and if you're using histograms, you will absolutely see so commonly this double spike. Now, the pictures I showed you before were generally smooth, maybe weighted towards one side or weighted towards the other for light or dark, but they didn't have two peaks. Now, if you think about what a landscape picture is made up of, it's the land and the sky. Okay, now the sky is 99 times out of 100 going to be brighter than the ground. And there's not much between the two. You've got darkish rainforest in this case, and you've got quite bright sky, but no midtones. This is why the exposure is so critical. And so let me see if I can just explain this carefully. If I set my exposure so that my highlight value is right at the limit without it going any further, that means that my shadows must be as light as they can possibly be in this exposure. If I underexpose this by one stop, I'll see I've got a big gap from the end to about there, and then all of these shadows will be crushed down, and there's a limit to how far I can recover those. So the upshot of that is, if you look into the darker greens inside the shadows here, you'll see, and I know this is a video screen and I'm hoping your screen looks reasonable, you'll see that there is texture and detail in this area here, these dark areas. If I squash that shadow information too much by underexposing, not only do you lose the detail, you also lose the color, because color can't really exist in a very, very dark tone. There's just not room for it. It goes to gray. So you can't have an almost black green. It's almost a dark gray. The saturation of colors is at its best in the midtones. You can't have a yellow that is so light. Or here's an example. Have you ever tried finding light blue paint? You put it on the wall, it looks grey, doesn't it? Because it can't have any saturation. The most intense colours are always in the midtones. Without going down too much colour theory, the least intense colours are at the limits of the tonal range, highlights and shadows. So when you have really poor shadows, not only are you lacking detail, but you're lacking colour. And the whole thing just looks muddy and horrible. So you need to get the exposure perfect in this case. That means you need to expose it as far as possible so that those highlights aren't clipped. Okay, so just to sum that up, shutter speeds control subject and camera movement, apertures control depth of field, and ISO amplifies the signals. If you change any one of those, you need to correct one of the others to keep the same exposure. So if I take my shutter speed to one higher, which is shorter, I'll either need to open up my aperture to let more light in, or increase my ISO by one step, or even do both. So every time I change one of those settings, given that the light itself hasn't changed, I'll need to adjust it with one of the other settings. And it's that juggling of these three that I call the exposure trinity, and it gives you a correct exposure if you get it right. Question is, how does that work? So I'm going to round this off in the next few minutes by explaining exactly how I get pretty much a perfect exposure every time, and it's really easy. This is one way of doing it. Choose your aperture, because aperture is kind of the most creative choice in most pictures, unless you're photographing movement for its own sake. Then you make sure your shutter speed is suitable. Now, that's a little bit slippery, I know, but at least high enough so you don't get camera shake by hand holding it, or if you're on a tripod, suitable to freeze the movement of whatever it is you want to freeze the movement of, or long enough to make something blur in some elegant way. So you choose that. And then you need to use whatever ISO is necessary to match the first two conditions. So the ISO is usually the thing that you choose last, or use auto ISO. You can use a combination of the two. And if you need to make an adjustment later, once you've taken the picture, if you don't have a camera with live histograms, for instance, like DSLRs don't have live histograms in the viewfinder, they do on the back of the camera when you're using them in live view mode, but that means you've got to work looking at the back of the camera in front of you, so that's not ideal. So that's the way I would normally work, but let me just move to something else for a sec. Give the exposure as much as possible to make sure the shadows are as light as possible. Now in this particular image, you'll see that the sky is very dark, but the highlights are absolutely critical. ETTR exposed to the right. Then before I show you what I do with the actual camera, and just a question just popped up. Ian Picken, so should we aim to set the auto exposure to intentionally slightly overexpose? Okay, so from what I've said so far, no. But like so many things, there's a nuance to this. So let me just digress briefly. What you're looking at on the back of your camera and what you're looking at with the histogram is a JPEG image, the data from a JPEG image, not a RAW file. You can't really have histograms from RAW files. It's tricky. Okay. RAW files always have more highlight headroom than JPEGs, just by the way that they're made internally. So you actually do have a little bit more highlight headroom than you think you do if you're following what I'm saying. Maybe half a stop, maybe 2/3 of a stop. Depends on the camera, and you may have to actually experiment yourself. When the histograms are generated in camera, and this was explained to me by Leica's senior camera designer, he's the manager of the design department, Stefan Schulz. He said that we always give you more than you think you have. So they will always want to err on the picture being slightly darker than the camera could have done. But then you can actually work it out for yourself what the limits are yourself. So you could try that. So very good question, Ian. But last slide before I go back to my camera. One thing you should always be wary of is not judging the exposure using the screen directly. And in the picture illustrating this point, this is at dusk, and the screen looked, at the time, I took this picture over the photographer's shoulder, looked blindingly white. And he was saying my picture's overexposed, and he was changing the exposure. I said, look at the histogram, and it was 4 stops underexposed. Because your eye adapts to the darkness, but the screen doesn't. If conversely, in bright sunshine, it's very easy to think your picture's too dark. So do not judge by the brightness of the screen, judge it by the data in the image, and that's what your histogram is. That's a really important thing. Okay, I'm going to come back to my camera here, and I'm going to show you how, there we go, how I judge my exposures to the point of pretty much nailing it every time. So what you should be able to see on the screen now is this Leica camera over here, and that image on the back looks reasonable. The ISO is 400, the aperture is 2.8, and the exposure is 1/10 of a second. Doesn't matter what those are. What I'm interested in is this histogram here. And can you see it fills up the left to the right limit almost perfectly. And I'm going to change the shutter speed and watch what happens. You see it gets darker and darker and darker. And can you see I've now got a gap? I'm hoping you can see this on the screen. I'll exaggerate it. You see? There's a great big gap where I'm pointing right now. And then as I increase the exposure by going to longer and longer shutter speeds, that little point is moving across to the right, to the right, to the right. And I would judge that by eye about correct. But there's a much better way of working. I have the clipping warning turned on, and different camera manufacturers call it different things. But by turning it on, watch what happens if I go even further. Go a bit more and a bit more. Now look, can you see here? That is telling me that that white background is now beyond white. And if I keep going, I get to the point where that's white. Now that is genuinely overexposed. What I want to do is set my exposure so that I get the flashing highlights and then I back it off just a bit. And if you can see right where I'm pointing just there, there should be a little tiny flashing highlight. Can you see it? I hope you can. That's what's called a specular highlight, and that's a reflection off the dial of my light. And there's nothing you can do about that. You can ignore those. What you need to do is make sure that none of the important highlights are flashing. So what I'm doing here, and this is in manual mode, if I was in aperture priority mode, I'll just go to aperture priority, which is there, I'd be using exposure compensation. And if you look at the bottom, you'll see my exposure compensation is coming up. It's choosing my aperture and my shutter speed for me, and I'm not using auto ISO at this point. All I'm doing is letting the camera pick the exposure. I'm checking that flashing highlight in the viewfinder, because what you see on here, you'll see in here as well. So if I'm not seeing the highlight, I will increase the exposure until I do, and then I'll back it off till it's gone. That will give you, come back to me, that will give you a technically perfect exposure every single time, because it's completely objective. There's no ifs and buts about it. It is absolutely perfect. It has to be. It may be lighter than you expect, but it's technically perfect. And that means that the data is as good as it can possibly be and everything is fine. Then in post, you can make it darker or whatever you want to do, but you know you've got that correct exposure. And that technique of using aperture priority with or without auto ISO, they're not entirely the same thing, that they can be used together, but using the exposure compensation just to check your highlights is unbelievably elegant and quick. And in high contrast situations, you will be able to nail your exposures pretty much instantly. And this is where the ergonomics of the camera come in. On the SL2, and I don't know how many of you listening have got SL type cameras, but we'll come back to the camera here. The exposure compensation dial is just here, and it just rolls under my finger. A shutter button here, it just rolls under my finger, and I can look through the viewfinder and move that without even having to think about it. Other cameras, the exposure compensation isn't in such a good place. So it's a very important thing to me when I'm choosing a camera is, where's my exposure compensation? Now, you can do the same thing in manual. I mean, we did it before. If I go back into the camera here and go back to manual, all I'm doing is changing the shutter speed myself. But why not let the camera do it for you? And then if you add in auto ISO, then you know, an aperture priority, you know that you're not going to get caught out by a shutter speed that's too low. So a combination of those two can be really, really effective. So that is pretty much ISO. Don't be worried about noise and use it to get a decent shutter speed. And exposure, if you use the exposure highlight warning and exposure compensation, you will be able to get your exposure absolutely perfect every single time. And that's the other thing I should mention is this is for cameras with electronic viewfinders or live view on the back, but particularly electronic viewfinders. Since I got the SL2, no, the original SL, which is about 5-6 years ago now, my success rate with exposures has gone from pretty good, because I have been doing this a long time, to almost 99%. It's very, very unusual for me to get an exposure wrong. And it's simply because what I'm seeing in the viewfinder is pretty accurate in the viewfinder. And what I said about judging the screen on the back is true, of course, but what you see in the viewfinder is shrouded. So you're looking in a black sort of cave and it's not so far off. That plus your exposure highlight warning, you absolutely nail it every single time. And just a bit of practice and you'll have it done. All right, that is exposure. Next month, we will be talking about depth of field. And that is going to be a slightly tricky one because depth of field is a really slippery concept. So I'll do my best to explain it, and you may come away from that talk, well, hopefully having learned something, but some of the myths that are floating around depth of field, I would definitely like to dispel, and there's a lot of them. So maybe join me next week for that. If there are any questions, I will gladly answer them now. And I see a couple have come in here. Tony, do same ISO exposure rules apply to black and white images as color? That's a tricky question to answer. I'd say yes at this point. In terms of this camera, then absolutely yes, because it is always capturing color. The black and white bit comes later. Even if you have the camera set to black and white, it's a conversion from a color capture with a Bayer array and all that to black and white. If you're shooting with an M monochrome, so the Q2 monochrome or the M monochrome, it's different. So thank you for raising the point. Never, ever overexpose with those cameras because you've only got one channel of information, not three. So if you have any clipping at all, that is white and nothing else. So with the monochrome cameras, I would definitely suggest you be a little more conservative, maybe by half a stop than your exposure, because there's nothing you can do about a clipped highlight on a monochrome. Okay, Ziggy, what if the camera's on full auto and the questions are coming in, and the blinking highlight? That's even on full automatic, you can still use exposure compensation. Okay. However, I would suggest that you don't use the camera on full automatic because I want you to be choosing the settings as much as possible, particularly the aperture. You need to take control of the camera. You need to make the picture look the way you want it to do. Okay. If you want to take pictures on full automatic, that's fine, but you won't have that subtle control that I'm talking about. So try not to use full automatic to use these techniques, but you can still use exposure compensation. Same thing applies. Any more questions? A few people saying thank you. Very welcome. You're very welcome. If anybody else has got any questions, happy to go. Otherwise, it's a little bit tricky with a 30-second delay because I can say this and then I'll say good night and then I'll get a question on the screen. Oh, here we go. See, it just happened. Chris, Nick, I note that my histogram shows a white image in one position only and yellow in others. Ooh, is white the camera's preferred setting? I'm not quite sure what you mean by a white image in one position only and yellow in others. It depends on the camera. The histograms on these cameras, as you can see, are just white. There's no color in it. So it's a little bit tricky. You may drop me an email or something if you want to expand on that, because I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Or you could maybe reword it here. That would be good. Anyway, people are saying thank you, so you're all very welcome. I know we're all locked down again. I am here. Luckily, I tend to work out of my studio in Brisbane, so being locked down, in my case, is not such a big drama, but I know for a lot of people it is, so it's a real shame. So hopefully we'll be out of it on Sunday. For those of you in Sydney, I hope things get better really soon, because it's no fun at all. Chris, okay, using the Deluxe 7, which I happen to have right here. I've just done a little video about this actually. Let me just turn that off. Back to me. I've got a Deluxe 7. I'll have to have a look and I'll get back to you. If you just want to drop me an email at Leica Academy, info@leicaacademy.com.au, ask me the question again and I'll do my best to answer it for you, Chris. So this will be recorded, or has been recorded already. As soon as I turn this off, within not very long at all, you'll see a little play arrow on the screen, but it will also get moved onto YouTube in a day or so. The same thing will happen with the depth of field one. So all of these end up on YouTube, and they're also all available to be viewed for a few weeks after I've actually done them through Crowdcast. I do delete them eventually off Crowdcast, but they'll always end up on the YouTube channel. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching. This is Nick Rains from Leica Academy Australia, signing off for another one of our webinars. Good night.